A black CEO, seated in first class, is confronted by a flight attendant who demands he move. The reason? A seat swap with a white passenger. What happens next will leave you stunned. The man, a powerful figure in business, is about to challenge the very system that thought they could control him, and in a way no one expected. As the plane sits on the tarmac, tensions rise. Will the flight even take off? What happens when a man fights back against the microaggressions that go unnoticed by so many? Stay tuned. This is more than just a seat dispute, it's about power, race, and the fight for respect. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are listening. Your support means everything. Derrick Williams had everything a man could dream of. A thriving career as the CEO of a successful tech company, a lavish apartment in the heart of the city, and a reputation as a rising star in the business world. He was often invited to exclusive conferences, rubbing elbows with influential figures and breaking barriers. But despite his success, there was something Derrick had learned to live with. A sense of never fully fitting in. Growing up in a modest neighborhood, Derrick was used to hearing whispers, glances, and the occasional comment that reminded him he wasn't always seen for his accomplishments, but for the color of his skin. It didn't matter that he'd put in countless hours, earned his position with blood, sweat, and tears. A society still viewed him differently. He'd learned to navigate this reality like so many others, keeping his head down and pushing forward. Today was no different. As he walked into the airport, his phone buzzing with emails and messages, he was focused on the next big meeting. An important pitch to secure a multi-million-dollar contract with a global firm. Everything had to go perfectly. Derrick knew the routine: a quick check-in, a couple of hours in the lounge, then onto the plane, where he could relax and prepare for the pitch. The first-class cabin was familiar, a haven where he could escape the outside world and decompress before the whirlwind ahead. He slid into his seat by the window, settled his briefcase beside him, and turned his attention to the flight details on the screen ahead of him. But something was different today. Something he couldn't quite place. There was a strange tension in the air, though he couldn't put his finger on why. As the boarding process continued, Derrick noticed a couple of passengers exchanging glances. He had seen that look before. It was subtle but unmistakable, the kind of look that said, "You don't belong here." He dismissed it quickly, focusing instead on the sound of the engines and the anticipation of what was to come. After all, he'd been on countless flights and had dealt with more than his fair share of judgmental stares. But then, the flight attendant approached. Her smile was bright, almost too bright. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I'm going to need you to move to another seat." Derrick paused, not fully understanding. He looked up at her, the confusion written across his face. Was this some kind of mistake? Surely she hadn't meant him. "I'm sorry," Derrick said, his voice calm but laced with uncertainty. "There's a problem." She looked around the cabin, as though double-checking, before responding. "We have a passenger in that seat who requested a change." She gestured toward a man further down the aisle. "You'll need to move." His mind raced. He was in first class, the seat had been booked, and there was no reason for him to move. But her tone was insistent, and the moment hung in there like a heavy weight. Was it his seat? Or was this about something more? "Is there an issue?" he asked again, trying to keep his voice steady. There was something about the way she was speaking, something about her demeanor, that made him feel like he wasn't being seen for the man he was. The flight attendant hesitated, her smile fading just slightly. "The passenger's request is very clear, sir." "I'm just doing my job." Derrick's stomach tightened, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a cold wave of frustration wash over him. It wasn't just about the seat. It was about the principle of it. How many times had he been asked to adjust, to make room, to accommodate? And for what? The subtle digs, the microaggressions, the daily reminders that his success could never outweigh the prejudice that came with his skin color. But this was different. This wasn't a passing comment or a raised eyebrow. This was public, it was official, and it was happening right now, in front of a whole cabin of strangers. "I'm not moving," Derrick said, standing his ground. "I've been in that seat for a reason. I paid for this flight, I booked the seat, and I'm not going anywhere." The flight attendants began to whisper among themselves. The murmur spread quickly. From the flight attendants to the passengers, Derrick could feel the eyes on him. Could hear the whispers rising into a dull roar. Some passengers stared at him with confusion, others with disapproval. There was no shortage of people who would have preferred he just complied. That's how things usually went, right? But Derrick didn't care about them. This wasn't for them. This was for him. This was his moment to draw a line in the sand. He wasn't going to be quiet. He wasn't going to retreat. He wasn't going to be made small. "I'm not moving," Derrick repeated. His voice cold and unwavering. "Not now, not ever." The flight attendant's eyes widened for a moment, clearly taken aback by his response. But it was too late for her to back down now. Derrick had already made up his mind. As she walked away, Derrick's heart pounded in his chest. The calm before the storm had passed. He could feel the tension building, and he knew the moment of reckoning was near. Something was about to happen, something that would make everyone in that cabin realize how deep this issue went. The plane was about to take off, but so was something else, something that had been festering inside Derrick for years. The question wasn't whether he'd move, but what would happen when he refused to, and what would the world do when he stood up and said, "No more." The stage was set. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Derrick sat back in his seat, hands gripping the armrests, the hum of the plane's engines vibrating through the cabin, but all he could hear was the pounding of his own heart. The initial shock of the flight attendant's request had worn off, and now, in its place, a heavy, creeping anger settled in his chest. It wasn't just the seat. It wasn't even about the inconvenience. It was about being forced into a situation where, once again, he was asked to make room for someone else, to shrink himself, to be less seen, less heard, less important. The flight attendant had walked away after Derrick refused to move, but she wasn't gone for long. Less than a minute later, she returned. This time with a manager, a tall, thin man who wore the same uniform but carried himself like he was above the fray. His name tag read Harold. He smiled politely, but it wasn't the smile of someone who was there to help. It was the smile of someone who had made up their mind before even saying a word. "Good afternoon, sir," Harold began, his voice smooth and rehearsed, like he was trying to sell him a product. "I understand there's been a misunderstanding about your seating arrangement." Derrick's lips tightened. He didn't want to hear the rehearsed lines. "There's no misunderstanding," Derrick replied, his voice calm but firm. "This is my seat. I paid for it. I'm not moving." Harold's smile faltered slightly, just enough for Derrick to notice. "You see, sir," Harold said, still with that unsettling calm, "we've had a request from another passenger to swap seats. They're not comfortable with their current placement. The airline has a policy to accommodate requests like this when possible, and unfortunately, this is one of those situations." Derrick clenched his jaw. He knew this wasn't just about a seat. It wasn't about comfort. This was about power, about control. He could feel it, deep in his gut. He had been a victim of it countless times before, but today, it felt different. This time, he wasn't going to let it slide. "I don't care about your policy," Derrick shot back, his voice growing louder now. "I'm sitting here, and I'm staying here. I don't care who asked you. It's my seat. That's the end of it." The tension in the cabin thickened, and Derrick felt all eyes turn toward him. The murmurs started quiet at first, but growing louder, until it felt like everyone was watching. The whispers were there, he could hear them. People were staring, no doubt wondering why he was being so difficult. Why couldn't he just move? Was it really worth the fuss? "Sir, please," Harold said, his voice softer now, almost condescending. "We're just trying to resolve the situation amicably. If you'd be willing to move, we'll make sure you're compensated for the inconvenience." Compensated? Derrick's blood began to boil. What was it about a black man in a first-class seat that made them feel entitled to treat him like an inconvenience? The idea of being compensated for simply having the audacity to take up space on a plane and a seat he paid for made him feel sick to his stomach. "I'm not moving," Derrick repeated, his voice cold and unwavering. "Not now, not ever." The flight attendant hovered by Harold's side, watching them both with a tense expression. Her hands folded tightly in front of her. Derrick couldn't help but notice that she wasn't even making eye contact with him anymore. She was looking at the ground, at the walls, anything but him. Was she embarrassed by the situation, or was she simply trying to avoid the fallout of her own actions? Harold took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for something difficult. He nodded toward the aisle, where a security officer was standing, his eyes scanning the scene. Derrick's chest tightened. He didn't have to be a genius to know what was coming next. This wasn't about policy anymore. This was about intimidation, pure and simple. "We'll have to ask you to disembark if you refuse to cooperate," Harold said, the words clipped and final. "We can't proceed with the flight if you're causing a disruption." Derrick felt a flash of disbelief. Was he really being asked to leave? He'd been on hundreds of flights. He knew how things worked. But this was a whole new level of injustice. The security officer, who had been watching from a distance, now took a few steps forward, his hand resting on the handle of his baton. Derrick stared at him for a long moment. He knew what was at stake now. If he backed down, it would send a message that this kind of treatment was acceptable, that people like him were disposable. And he wasn't going to let that happen. "I'm not leaving," Derrick said, his voice steady but filled with an unshakable resolve. "I'm a paying customer. I have rights." Harold and the security officer exchanged a glance, one that spoke volumes. They hadn't expected him to stand his ground like this. They'd assumed he'd crumble, just like all the others who had been asked to step aside for the sake of comfort, for the sake of convenience. But Derrick wasn't moving. Not today. The flight attendants began to whisper among themselves. The murmur spread quickly, from the flight attendants to the passengers. Derrick could feel the eyes on him, could hear the whispers rising into a dull roar. Some passengers stared at him with confusion, others with disapproval. There was no shortage of people who would have preferred he just complied. That's how things usually went, right? But Derrick didn't care about them. This wasn't for them. This was for him. This was his moment to draw a line in the sand. He wasn't going to be quiet. He wasn't going to retreat. He wasn't going to be made small. "I'm not moving," Derrick repeated, his voice cold and unwavering. "Not now, not ever." The flight attendant's eyes widened for a moment, clearly taken aback by his response. But it was too late for her to back down now. Derrick had already made up his mind. As she walked away, Derrick's heart pounded in his chest. The calm before the storm had passed. He could feel the tension building, and he knew the moment of reckoning was near. Something was about to happen, something that would make everyone in that cabin realize how deep this issue went. The plane was about to take off, but so was something else, something that had been festering inside Derrick for years. The question wasn't whether he'd move, but what would happen when he refused to, and what would the world do when he stood up and said, "No more." The stage was set. Resolution and impact. The cabin remained tense. The sound of the engines almost drowned out by the growing murmurs of the passengers. Derrick's heart pounded in his chest as he stood resolute. Every word, every action had led to this point. The security officer's hand still rested on the baton at his side, but Derrick could sense the hesitation in his posture now. The power dynamic had shifted, and it was clear to everyone that Derrick wasn't backing down. As the passengers waited, some in silence, others watching with bated breath, a few began to speak up. "He's right," a voice from the back of the cabin called out. "Let the man keep his seat." The words echoed, and soon others joined in. "Stop treating him like this." Another passenger shouted, "Let him sit where he belongs." Derrick could feel the ground shift beneath him. The solidarity that had begun as whispers now became a tidal wave of support. One by one, the passengers began to speak out, their voices rising in unison, a chorus of resistance to the treatment they had all witnessed. Harold, the flight manager, looked to the security officer, his earlier authority now replaced with uncertainty. He realized that the situation was no longer in his hands. The crew had lost control of the narrative, and it wasn't going to be easily regained. The security officer stepped back, his expression wavering. It was no longer about enforcing policy. It was about how to save face in front of a plane full of people who were now standing with Derrick. Derrick could feel a wave of empowerment course through him. His voice, which had once been silenced by years of injustice, was now being heard. The world was watching. He wasn't just fighting for his seat anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been made to feel small and important, or invisible because of their race. He was fighting for the countless people who had never had the opportunity to stand up in the way he was doing now. Harold looked to the captain, who had been silent until now, and then back at the crew. The captain, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, stepped forward, his presence cutting through the tension in the cabin. "Mr. Williams," the captain said, addressing Derrick with newfound respect, "I apologize for the misunderstanding. This situation is being handled incorrectly, and I assure you, this will not happen again. You will remain in your seat, as you are entitled to. This flight will proceed as planned, with you in your assigned spot." Derrick nodded, not out of gratitude, but because the words coming from the captain's mouth meant something much bigger. It wasn't just about this flight anymore. It was about something much more powerful: the acknowledgement of his rights, his dignity, and his refusal to be treated as less than. The captain turned to the flight attendants, giving them a silent signal to return to their duties, but the weight of the moment lingered. The crew had been forced to recognize the injustice in their actions, and their resolve had been tested. The passengers who had spoken up knew they had made a difference, and for many of them, this was a turning point. As the plane finally began to taxi down the runway, the murmurs faded. But Derrick knew the impact of what had just happened wouldn't. He felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of victory, not just for himself, but for anyone who had been silently suffering, just waiting for their moment to speak up. When the plane landed at its destination, Derrick's phone buzzed incessantly. His video had gone viral. It wasn't just a story of a black man standing up for his seat. It was a symbol of defiance, of taking back control in a world that had so often tried to strip it away. People from all over the world, not just black people, but individuals from all walks of life, were rallying behind him, commenting with messages of support, encouragement, and admiration. But Derrick knew this wasn't just a one-time victory. This was the beginning of a larger conversation. The same systems that had forced him into this situation were still in place. And while one plane ride wasn't going to change the world, it could spark something bigger. The airline issued a public apology for the incident, and Derrick's story became a talking point across news outlets, social media platforms, and workplaces. The flight attendants were retrained, and the airline made changes to its policies, ensuring that no passenger would ever be subjected to the kind of treatment Derrick had faced. But Derrick knew that while these changes were important, they were not enough. This was a systemic issue, and it required more than just surface-level solutions. It required a shift in how society viewed race, power, and privilege. He knew the fight wasn't over, it was only just beginning. For Derrick, this was not a moment of finality, but a call to action. His phone continued to buzz with messages of support, but one in particular caught his eye. It was a message from his mother, a woman who had always reminded him of the power of perseverance and self-worth. It simply read, "I'm proud of you. You showed them who you are." And in that moment, Derrick understood. This was never about the seat. This was about standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been pushed aside, silenced, or diminished because of the color of their skin. His actions had rippled outward, and now, it was time to turn that ripple into a wave. Racism doesn't just show up in overt acts of violence or hate. It's in the small, everyday moments, the assumptions, the bias, the microaggressions. But change begins when people, like Derrick, stand up and refuse to accept the status quo. Every small act of defiance matters, and every time someone says, "No more," it shakes the very foundations of the system that seeks to divide us. Derrick had won the battle for this seat, but the war for respect, equality, and justice was far from over. And as long as there were people willing to speak out, to stand up, and to fight, change was inevitable. The world had seen his stand. And now, the world was watching, waiting for the next person to rise. This is just the beginning.